Today I'm going to talk to you about robbery investigation, but first I'd like you to take a look at an actual robbery in progress. You're going to have to watch closely because the action happens quickly on this tape. The weapon that the subject has in his hand is a full beer bottle.
Shut up. Rick, open it. Hey, hurry up and open it. Hurry up and open it. Open it. Open it. Hurry up. I say hurry up now.
Crime scene. And now, your crime scene host, Alan Ackles.
Witnesses to armed robberies are a source of frustration to investigators. Taken by surprise, threatened with deadly weapons, they're understandably difficult to get information out of. They remember very little, and much of what they do remember is wrong. Studies have shown that witnesses subjected to the stresses of robbery are very limited in their ability to identify the suspects involved. Unless the witness knows the suspect, or in some cases, when the witness's exposure is for an extended time under good lighting conditions, witness ID is unlikely. One store clerk who survived a robbery recently was asked to describe the robber. He was about this big around, the clerk answered, making a circle with his hands, and he had one big black eye. Well, the poor man had focused so exclusively on the robber's handgun that the muzzle of the gun was all he could remember. Problems with witnesses mean that crime scene investigation is especially important in robbery offenses, and that's our subject today. Our instructor is Sergeant Tony Monheim from the Metro-Dade Robbery Investigation Unit in Dade County, Florida. He's a well-known expert in the field.
Most robbery statutes throughout the states define robbery basically in the same manner. Robbery is the taking of property from someone, a person, by force or threat of force. Now, there are certain extreme examples where this example is stretched to the limit. One of these would be a recent rash of robberies we've had in the Dade County area, which we call drug-induced robberies. These are committed by a gang that has been dubbed the Rolex robbers. It's a gang of female robbers who meet potential victims in bars, at convention centers, and tourist traps, tourist bars, where they solicit a drink from the intended victim and eventually persuade him to take them back to their room or to their home if they live in the area. At some point during the evening, in one of the drinks, a drug is induced into the drink, usually scopolamine, which renders the victim unconscious for anywhere from 20 to 24 hours. Once unconscious, the robbers have their compatriots come and remove property from his person, or in some instances that we've had here recently, entire house loads of furniture, including the wall-to-wall carpeting, has been taken, leaving the victim lying naked in the floor in the living room, waking up with a headache. Usually in these situations, the victim doesn't remember what happened to him for 3 or 4 days, and slowly during this 3 or 4 day period his memory comes back to him. He remembers encountering a female in a bar, and slowly it comes back. So in an instance such as this is actually a robbery because the victim has been rendered unconscious intentionally in order that property might be taken from him. Shoplifting situations are other examples of the statute being stretched. For example, in your common shoplifting situation, the shoplifter is encountered by a security guard or a clerk employee taking the property. If a struggle ensues and the shoplifter retains the property after the struggle, this becomes a robbery. If the struggle ensues, the subject drops the property and flees, this is no longer a robbery. I understand it's a fine line, it's a very narrow gray area. However, the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting System insists that crimes be reported actually for what they are. And in this instance, it's either a robbery or it isn't a robbery. There has to be a determination made somewhere. Another example would be a tow truck driver who makes a repossession at a residence. If the tow truck driver is making a repossession and struggles or has an altercation, a physical altercation with the victim, this again becomes a robbery. Picture this scenario. A convenience store where the clerk sees two men get out of a car in the parking lot, don masks, hold masks over their heads, produce firearms, and start walking to the convenience store. The clerk immediately locks the door and runs to the back of the store with no confrontation between the subjects and the victim. Robbery or no robbery? It's not a robbery. It's not a robbery because the magic words were never said. There was never a demand for property, and there was never any property taken. There might have been any number of reasons why those people were there with guns to meet that victim. Lastly, the most extreme example I can think of is a robbery I handled several years ago, in which a young female victim who was 9 years old, I believe, had just bought a double dip ice cream cone from an ice cream vendor, was walking away from the ice cream truck, and a subject came up and demanded a bite out of the ice cream cone. When she refused, he grabbed her by the pigtails and shook her head violently, used his teeth to grab the double scoop of ice cream from the cone, and fled, holding the ice cream and eating it in his hand as he fled. Unfortunately for me, robbery. I had to handle it as such. You have to remember that anything or any person that possesses anything of value can be a potential robbery target. Banks, armored cars, bill collectors, payrolls, those are something of an acronym, something from the past, but we still have payroll robberies from roofing companies where they keep payrolls on hand and pay their employees in cash. Liquor stores, gas stations, pharmacies. When I first came to robbery in 1973, heroin was the top drug at the time, and many of the robbers were heroin addicts and would rob pharmacies to obtain Dilaudid, which they could melt down. It's an opiate derivative, and they could melt that down into a heroin-like substance and use that in place of heroin. Convenience stores naturally are frequent targets of robberies. Fast food establishments. Recently, 2 Broward County deputies were gunned down responding to a silent alarm at a fast food chicken store in Broward County. One of the deputies was killed and the other was mortally wounded. Hotels, motels, jewelry stores, and messengers. Here in the Miami area, it's a transport point for a lot of jewelry messengers from New York to South America, diamond carriers and couriers. And in situations where you have a messenger robbed like this, it's good to look at who had knowledge of the courier and where he was going and where he was staying. In most of the instances where a courier is robbed, it was set up by someone who had knowledge about his itinerary. Farm stores, which are indigenous to this area, which are a type of convenience store. House robberies, home invasion type robberies. These are the most brutal probably of all robberies because they, in some instances, will torture people in their homes in order that they might locate a safe inside the house so that the people will open a safe. I recently worked a case in which they forced a homeowner to put his hand down in a garbage disposal and threatened turning on the garbage disposal until he revealed the combination to the safe, which he did naturally. Roadside robberies, driveway muggings, these are probably the most common robberies that you'll encounter as a robbery investigator. Parking lot muggings, gambling houses, illegal gambling houses. In Miami we have Bolita, which is similar to lottery or lotto, and many times the counting houses are robbed. Again, this is a situation where someone has knowledge that money is being kept there or illegal goods are being kept there. Dope houses are common targets of robberies. Lovers' lanes robberies occur where people are out parking along a beach such as this. In fact, along this beach we've had very many lovers' lane type robberies where the people are accosted inside their car and forced to give up their belongings. Hitchhikers are sometimes picked up and robbed. Homosexuals are frequent targets of robberies. Along with homosexuals, prostitutes, transvestites, elderly purse snatch victims are probably going to be the bulk of all robberies that a robbery investigator will handle. As exotic and as much fun to handle as an armored car or bank robbery is, the bulk of your robberies are going to be elderly purse snatch victims. Hijackings, those are a robbery that is usually committed by a professional, someone that has intricately planned out this type of robbery. Let's get into who does robberies. The average age for a robber is 18.1 years. They're young. In Florida, the statistics will bear it out, and throughout the country, 70% are black, and the average robber is overwhelmingly male. 94% of all robberies in this country are committed by males. The majority have long criminal histories, which brings us to the term maturation robber. A maturation robber is a robber who has, maturing through his criminal past, has matured into a robber. You can read their rap sheets like a book. They start out with petty theft, with trespass, graduate to burglary. From burglary, they may go to a strong arm robbery where they do a purse snatch, and then to an armed robbery. It's a progressive type of maturation till they reach the pinnacle of their criminality, which is robbery. And in this regard, you have to remember that the robber, once he goes to prison, is considered somewhat of a hero. He's renowned, he's revered, he's thought of in the hierarchy of the prison as the top dog, one of the top dogs in the prison system. He's second only probably to a cop killer or a murderer. A robber is not a sneak thief. He's bold and he's brazen, he's a braggart, and he's very egotistical. This is something that we have to remember because it can work to a definite advantage to the robbery investigator. Because they are bold and brazen and egotistical and they brag about their exploits, they talk about the robberies, and many times informants can provide you with information as to who committed your robberies. Usually robbers are under the influence of some drug or alcohol, which makes them a volatile type of person. They're dangerous. You have to be very leery and wary of a robber. In fact, 11 out of the last 13 police officers who have been killed in the line of duty in Dade County were killed by robbers. I've categorized robbers into two types of robbers. You have your amateur robber, who most robbers fall in this category, are your marauding type juvenile robbers who cruise in vehicles. I term them juvenile predators who prey on elderly victims, you do purse snatchings, knock the elderly victims down to take their property. Coupled with that, you have the armed small business specialists who rob many of the businesses that I mentioned earlier, the convenience stores, the liquor stores, the gas stations, etc. Secondly, you have the professional robber. These are robbers that rob banks, armored cars, commit hijackings. Usually these are well planned out, well thought of robberies. And it's a pleasure to work these type of robberies after working some of the mundane and boring type robberies.
Techniques to preserve and analyze physical evidence have kept pace with high technology in the 1980s. As investigators, you owe it to yourselves to keep abreast of developments in the field. Tony Monheim will be back in a moment with more on robbery investigations, so stay with us.
Hurry up.
No problem.
Hurry up.
Okay?
Everything.
Okay.
Move. Sit down. Yes, sit down. Open your refrigerator bag.
Okay.
Open your bag.
Okay.
This deal.
Okay. No, go.
Let's talk about how to solve a robbery. Actually, it's not really that difficult. We have many things going for us when we're doing a robbery investigation. First of all, we have a face-to-face confrontation between the victim and the subject. This is unusual. In a burglary, you don't usually have this. In a homicide, you may have it, but you don't have a victim that's available to give you any information. In a robbery, you have that face-to-face confrontation, and hopefully the victim has gotten a good enough look at the subject that should you determine who the subject is, they'll be able to identify him for you. Many times, you have witnesses other than the victim. In business robberies in particular, where the clerk is robbed, you may have customers going in and out of the business that had an opportunity to look at the subject's face. In this instance, you hope that the witnesses can provide you with an identification when you do find out who the robber is. Thirdly, and most importantly, is what I term robbery axiom number one. Over the years, I've been in robbery for 14 years, a robbery investigator, and I've noticed little axioms or rules to live by. And one of them, the first one that I have realized, is that robbers aren't brain surgeons. These people are dumb, or they wouldn't be robbers. That's why they're in the business that they're in. This is dumb with a capital D, but it can also translate into dangerous. Robbers are dangerous, highly volatile people. They're also stupid with a capital S. They're braggarts, and they love to brag about their exploits. And this works to our advantage because of the use of informants. robbers generally go back to their crack den, to the bar that they frequent, to their little circle of friends, and they brag about what they've done. They brag about their exploits, the great robbery, the great score that they've put down. What we rely on then is that these people who overhear these conversations either get arrested or call us and provide us with the information that would help us solve that robbery. Fourthly, robbery is a crime that's second only to homicide or rape, which raises the public interest and the public ire. Many Crime Stoppers segments, if you'll notice on television, are done about robberies because robbery is a brutal, vicious crime. Usually the victim is if at the very least terrorized, can also be hurt during the robbery. Many times pistol whipped, beaten during this robbery. So it raises the public attention and the public ire, and people are usually more upset about a robbery than any other crime, with the exception maybe of rape or murder. Robbers are creatures of habit, and this is particularly important. Robbers use the same MO virtually in every type of robbery they do. If a robber comes into a convenience store and grabs a box of Pampers and puts it on the counter, then sticks up the convenience store clerk, he's going to do that in the next robbery, and the next robbery, and the next robbery. They're serial criminals. They do things over and over and over. Robbers don't do just one robbery. Robbers commit robberies until they're caught or until they move out of the area. Usually, the average robber, from my experience, commits maybe 20 to 30 robberies before his luck runs out and he's apprehended. So in order to determine who the robbers are, and who's robbing which stores, we have to establish some type of method of operation, some type of MO, something that is peculiar or particular to that robber. And then you can use link-ups to link robberies together after you capture the robbery subject. Victims, surprisingly, rarely provide the information that solves the case. Victims, you would hope, at the very least, can identify the robber when you find out who he is. They very rarely give you that information, that lead, that name that tells you who the robber is. Most cases are solved by informants, by uniformed police officers who patrol that district, that are aware of the criminal element in their area that they work in. Other adjacent police departments who've had similar type robberies and give you the information on a robbery they may have solved. Evidence on the scene, being fingerprints, blood evidence, hair evidence, trap photography that we've used in our robbery section to obtain photographs of robberies as they commit the robberies, videotape that might have been used or taken during the robbery. Many stores now have video cameras which capture the robbery in progress. And other detectives within your section or other robbery sections in surrounding police departments may provide you with the information that will solve your robbery case. Research has shown that the single best clue that a victim or witness can provide to you is a good vehicle description. In our robbery section with the Metro-Dade Police Department, we keep an AMA auto ID book handy. Every investigator has that book in his briefcase. So when we get a description of a vehicle, we not only get the year and make and color from the victim, we have him thumb through the book and find that exact car in that book. So we'll know if we're talking about a 73 Cougar, well, what the victim thinks might be a 73 Cougar may be a 69, it may be a 68. He may be a little confused. Once he looks through that AMA book and picks out that picture, he'll say, this is the car I'm talking about. Then you can make a bulletin which can be passed out to other police agencies or other members of your department and use a Xerox copy of that car. And every police officer then knows which car he's looking for. If it's a stolen car, the odds are that they'll still have that car and they'll still be using it in robbery. So the vehicle is probably the best clue that you can come up with, other than if the victim says, well, I've seen this guy in here many times before. I know that he's a frequent customer here. I know who he is. He'll be back in. That's probably the easiest robbery to solve. In order to be a good robbery investigator, you have to be several things. You have to be innovative. You have to be resourceful, and you have to be adaptable. I can recall one investigation we did in which we set up a surveillance in which a snitch was to meet a member of a robbery gang that was going to go out and do another robbery. It was going to be a house robbery. This individual was an antique dealer, and he was supposed to set up someone that he had just sold some expensive antiques to, and the individuals in the robbery group were going to go do a house robbery at this particular residence. We had decided that the robber and the person setting up the robber would meet at a Dunkin' Donuts store, and we had placed a tape recording device underneath the booth in which they were supposed to sit. Unfortunately for us, they picked the wrong booth and they sat in the wrong booth. We didn't get any audio on the conversation, but we did get a video through the window, and by means of a concealed video in a van parked out in the parking lot, we got a video of the conversation. Using resourcefulness and adaptability, we realized that we didn't have the audio, but we took that video to a Catholic nun school for deaf children and left it with them. They were more than happy to look at this video over and over and over for the next week and a half and provide us with a transcript of the exact conversation that took place by looking at this video. And if you want good witnesses in a court presentation, bring several nuns in to court, and I guarantee you that the judge is going to look at them as believable witnesses. Robbery axiom number 2 that I've determined over the years of working in robbery is that you have to control the investigation. You can't let the investigation control you. Simply translated, this means don't spin your wheels. You have to know what is important and what is not important in a robbery investigation. In my section with the Metro-Dade Robbery Unit, we handle 8,700 robberies a year. That's what our total was last year, with 30 investigators. This works out to a caseload of approximately 40 to 60 robberies per month. Last month we had 900 robberies with this amount of investigators. We have to know what is important and what is not important, and we have to know when not to spin our wheels. We have to know when to improvise. That brings us to robbery axiom number 3. An old-time robbery sergeant that trained me in the early 70s when I first came to robbery, whenever we would ask him a question, how should we do this, Sarge, how should we do that, he would tell us, your detectives improvise. And that's the key to robbery investigation. You have to be able to be resourceful enough to improvise. If the situation changes, you have to adapt to that situation. You have to be able to be resourceful and to work toward a successful conclusion on that investigation, no matter what it takes, no matter what direction you have to go in.
Move.
The armed robbery is the prototype of violent crime. Studies show that over half of the men arrested in a dozen U.S. cities last year for major crimes tested positive for drugs. More and more deadly firearms are finding their way onto our streets. In an armed robbery, the life of the victim is balanced on the hair trigger of a desperate offender, often a loser on drugs. If your crime scene search can turn up one piece of evidence that will help make a case against one armed robber, then you've made a major contribution. Stay on top of developments in your field and don't sell yourself short. There's no limit to what you can do to get dangerous offenders off the street. Only your imagination. Our thanks to Tony Monheim for being with us today. I'm Alan Ackles, and thank you for joining us on Crime Scene.